Welcome today to the Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative's fifth webinar in our series Lessons from the Field in a Time of Rapid Change and Crisis. To everybody signed on today, thank you for taking the time out of your Thursday to join us. We have a great session planned today with guest Shepherd Christiansen, who I will introduce here in a minute and who I'm very excited to have with us today. To introduce myself, my name is Ben Williamson and I'm the Executive Director here at NRCC. And before we begin, I thought I'd go quickly over sort of the purpose and format for these conversations, just to give a little bit of a background. We started this series earlier this summer to sort of showcase the tools and experiences of people who are working to innovate in the environmental field by working across sort of typical human and ecological boundaries. And this is the type of cross-disciplinary work that NRCC has fostered over its 33 years. And just given the historical times we're in, it felt just like a pertinent time to give a platform to some of our folks like Katie in the NRC network to sort of make sense of this moment. So if you've seen any of the first four, each of these conversations has had a slightly different flavor to it, but all are structured around the same 5 questions. So I'll ask the question and then give the chance to our guests to respond, and then hopefully it'll take on a conversational tone. And we'll leave about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. So if you have a question, feel free to start typing it into the chat box and we'll get to it at the end. We have one more session after today, so make sure to register on Zoom. And then lastly, we are recording these and they will be made available on our site. So you just go to the Summer Webinar Series tab at nrccooperative.org and then click on the profile picture of whoever you'd like to watch. So that's it for logistics. Thank you all for attending today, and I'll just move right into introducing today's guest, Shepherd Christiansen. So Katie is an interdisciplinary conservationist who works through various channels: art, education, organizing, policy, science, storytelling, amongst many others, to build consensus around shared values in communities and conservation. She sees her work in storytelling as a means to connect people to landscapes and to each other, and in doing so, move closer to what is the common interest for both humans and the non-human. Katie is currently the artist in residence here at NRCC. She's a talented natural history illustrator and uses watercolor as her primary medium. In 2019, Katie designed and developed a National Endowment for the Arts funded interpretive installation for Bozeman Story Mill Community Park. So if you're ever in Bozeman, you got to check it out. It's a great park. And then this past summer, through a second NEA-funded grant, Katie designed the interpretive signage for the new Astoria Hot Springs Park just south of Jackson to sort of draw attention to the natural history found at the site along the Snake River. Katie is also the editor of the forthcoming book, The Artist's Field Guide to Yellowstone, which will be released later this year, and we'll get more into that. And Katie is a graduate of the Yale School of the Environment, where she was a Weiss Conservation Scholar for the American West. She then moved to Bozeman for many years, but now resides with her husband and new son along the Front Range of Colorado, where she is joining us from today. So I'd like to first just say, extend a warm hello and welcome to Katie for being with us today.
Thank you, Ben. I'm really grateful to be here. I'm grateful to NRCC for hosting this summer series. I've enjoyed it so much. I would encourage everyone to go to NRCC's website and check out the videos and recordings of some of the previous speakers. I feel honored to be among the list of the crew who you're giving a platform to today. And I want to mention too that as we go along here, if anybody who's listening in has questions, to use the chat function. Probably, would that be the right place to offer some questions, Ben?
Totally, yep.
Yeah, because it'd be great to just, if anything we're talking about sparks an interest or questions, we'd love to hear about that.
Absolutely, thanks. Yeah, thank you for that. And I think the Q&A at the end can be a pretty robust time to sort of dig into some of the topics that we discussed. So definitely encourage that. I thought before we totally jump into the questions, that I wanted to give you just a chance to give a sort of a quick update on your book. And so could you just give us like a quick background to what the book is, and then when it will be released, because I know it's coming soon, and that's been a long time coming. So maybe just a quick update there.
Yes, it has been a long time coming, and it probably deserves more than a quick update, but I think we will get into some of the details of that soon. But I'll say just to, for everybody listening right now, that thank you for joining me in this journey of book publishing, and we're nearing the finish line, at least for this first stage. So my publisher, Trinity University Press, has let me know as of yesterday that we're going to have books out in time for holiday giving. So I would suspect that would mean late fall. And what I'm excited to say too, and kind of announce today, is that this first phase of book availability is going to be made through a partnership with the Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative. NRCC has been such an amazing partner throughout the process of working on this project that has had many legs over many years. And I felt so fortunate to work with NRCC through the journey, and then to now be able to work in partnership to offer the book just to the NRCC community before the rest of the public. So the book is going to be on bookshelves in spring of next year, but this fall and through the winter, NRCC is going to be kind of hosting all of the first round book sales with proceeds going back to NRCC. So Ben, what would be the best way for folks to stay engaged on that, to know when and how to order when the time comes?
Yes. Well, first off, like, we're just really excited and have just loved being supportive of the book over the last how many years you've been working on it. So, and we're excited that we can be sort of the ones that get to distribute it and get our hands on it before anybody else. And so if folks here are listening, you can go to our website and sign up for our newsletter. And then later this fall, we will be sending out some information on where to buy the book. And then, as Katie mentioned, some of those proceeds will go back to NRCC. So I hope that everyone takes advantage of that opportunity. So yeah, we're excited about that. So with that, I think we should just dive right into the sort of 5 questions, if that sounds good.
Let's do it.
So let's get going here. So question number 1, just to sort of get things started, and take this how you will. In your words, what do you do? And tell us how you got to where you're at, and why does the work that you do matter to you, in any way you'd like to explain?
Well, I will start off maybe by putting out there what my overarching goal is in my work, and that is to contribute to a future reality where we have healthy ecosystems and healthy human communities. And I don't think we're on a pathway currently for that future. So I say an alternative future, because the future we're heading towards isn't gonna get us there. And opening just about any newspaper will suggest that that's the case. So I'm talking about working on things that are going to transition us in that direction. So it's kind of working on things that are in a bit of a revolutionary kind of context. And not to say that I'm always effective at that, but just to put it out there, I'm looking to do work differently, because I think we need different work to achieve this different and new future scenario. And specifically, when I talk about different work, I'm talking about an interdisciplinary approach, which you credited me to at the beginning in the bio, and I hope I can live up to that. And I think we'll have an opportunity to get more in depth into what that means, an interdisciplinary approach to conservation. But it's a tall order, and it's maybe intimidating, but in short, without integrating and without understanding really the problems that we face, I fear, and scholars, people who know a lot more than me, fear that we're going to be addressing the wrong kinds of problems. And maybe we all have this goal, and I think many people share this goal that I have of healthy human and wild communities, but if we see problems differently, we're going to come up with different ways to solve those problems. And I'd like us to solve the right problem so that we can achieve that future. So that's kind of, that's vaguely what I do. We can get into some of the specifics of my approach to that, but I thought maybe too, I could start sharing just briefly about my journey, because so much of my work is trying to work at this interface of culture and values. I work in education, I work in storytelling, policy, even science. And normally maybe people wouldn't think of science as working at values, but I see that being a space, values and culture, where we can make the most impact to shift our reality towards this future. And so I feel like it's only fair for me to share my own values and way that I see the world working. In the way I've come to those values. So I was really fortunate to have grown up in a rural community in northern Michigan, where a national park was a couple miles down the road, and I spent a lot of time outside. I felt very connected to the seasons and to the ecosystem there. And then I was within a family that promoted integration and community. I saw that responsibility to, and even sacrifice for, community being lived out every day, and an awe of nature, a kinship with nature. And I came out of childhood with this understanding of the world around me as one who was a part of that. Instead of nature being something that was separate, I felt very connected to nature, and then and still do seek time in nature as my grounding space. So today, what that looks like with a new kid is a lot of time pushing a stroller on town trails here in the Front Range. But over the years, that's looked like a lot of outdoor activity, nature journaling, just being meditative in the outdoors. And I took that love and passion and went into my undergraduate experience studying the sciences. But really, at the end of the day, as much as I maybe romanticize the life of a wildlife biologist and that kind of rugged independence that maybe an Aldo Leopold gave off, and who I idolized, I'm somebody who is probably better suited to work with people. And I also realized that many of these problems that we consider environmental problems are actually people problems. So it seems like the most effective way for me to go about doing my work.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's a lot that's really interesting. I think you hit on an important piece that we often think of science as sort of this like valueless sort of project, but when we situate science within sort of the larger picture, we see that it's actually a way that we distribute values in a really specific way. So it's like important to see science sort of as sort of this just piece of the larger puzzle, instead of just sort of this like sort of overwhelming like truth-telling structure. So I think that's interesting, and I think a lot of people that have gone through NRCC have come to sort of that same realization of sort of framing environmental issues more in this sort of human terms. So yeah, I'm curious. So then what happened after undergrad? Like, did you continue to evolve along that, or like what was the next step?
Yeah, I was someone then who probably would have said that science is this overarching truth, and was fortunate to encounter some just amazing people over the last 10 years, which is how long it's been since I was an undergrad. And upon moving to Bozeman, which was 10 years ago now, and making my home in the Rockies, who encouraged me down pathways that led me to the School of Forestry, well, now the Yale School of the Environment, where I interacted with advisors, mentors, and peers who brought new information to the fore for me. I was 25 at the time, and had 25 years of experience living in some beautiful places, but not places where I was necessarily engaging in many non-conventional ways.
Mm.
And instead, during grad school, I had to confront my own convention. I had to confront my own biases and assumptions. And I'll tell you, it like kept me up all night and made me sick to my stomach for a while. And I had a very hard time articulating what in the world I was doing, because I thought I had gone to grad school to study grizzly bears. And instead, I'm in grad school talking about values and culture and society. And I think I found it more confusing than obvious to begin with. But those same generous and wise people were also patient people and stuck with me and led me to NRCC. So I served as an intern originally for NRCC during my time in grad school. And then when I graduated grad school, I kind of graduated from intern into a research associate at NRCC. And then for the past few years now, I've been an artist in residence. And yeah, from NRCC community, from this grad school community, I've really understood more about the way that I can be a collaborative member of the conservation community, which is where I've always seen myself. I mean, before I maybe understood some of this value system work, I knew that I wanted to work with people. I knew I wanted to work in collaboration and community building. And like I said at the beginning, that's what I saw happening in my family. And so that just really made sense to me. That was a good fit. But now I see how in collaboration can look a lot of different ways. And to do it effectively in the framework for this new future for us, we need to get clear on goals and problems. And I really enjoy that work. I really like working in partnership with people to identify shared and common interests. And with some of my interpretive work as an example, my theory and why I think some of my work in interpretation, whether it's in the new Astoria Park or Bozeman Story Mill Park, I think that by putting thoughtful and contextual interpretive resources out to the world, that's my way of trying to connect people to nature, to their sense of place, and then to these shared values. And by doing so, maybe we can just start to think about societal change. And of course, if I'm the only one doing interpretive resources, that's not going to happen. We need people at all levels, all over the world, all the time, doing this kind of work. But that's where I've found I can contribute right now. And my art is part of that too. I feel like art has this unique way of getting at values and connecting truth to beauty. And so it seems worth my time to explore that interface at the moment.
Yeah. I was curious, I actually don't really know this that well. It's just like, when did art become sort of a craft of yours, and how did you foster that? Because you obviously have like a skill at art and watercolor specifically. So like, where did that come from?
That's a great question. Until probably a year ago, I would not have called myself an artist. I see myself as this community builder. I like to work with artists. My book, which is 8 years in the making, was working within the artist community. I like the idea of working with and fostering an artistic community, but not because I was an artist myself, because I recognize the role art can play, and that seemed important. So I better give it a platform. And now I'm serving as an artist, and it just is a little mind-boggling. But I had a really artistic grandmother, and I think I found nature journaling and sketching to be one way that I could transition some of my outdoor time into something that was less consumptive. For example, there was a moment in time when I fly fished, and as somebody who doesn't eat meat, I found that to suddenly not be a fitting activity for me to do. And so how was I going to spend time out at the river? And that was with my sketchbook and pens and watercolors. And I think I'm also just kind of stubborn And if you see the size of my paintbrush here, it's just like the tip of this is really small. And so it takes a certain level of stubbornness to paint individual pieces of fur on an elk, or, you know, the braids of feathers on a bald eagle. So I haven't had formal training in art. I think it's, yeah, some being an observer of the natural world and being a bit stubborn and kind of insisting on wanting to capture this awe that I see in all of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think art itself is such a powerful tool to sort of break down the barrier between the observer and the object. And I know I've seen a lot of your paintings and it certainly does that. So thank you for all that. I think just for time's sake, we'll keep moving here. Even though I'd love to keep talking more about art, and we'll come back to it. But so for this sort of second question, sort of a two-leveled question. And basically we're just trying to understand sort of how you're making sense of the current context and sort of moment we're living through right now, given how unprecedented it is. So don't feel pressure to synthesize this all into one answer, but it's more just to understand your personal view of the developments. But so first, how are you, or how has your work and life been affected by the pandemic? And then secondly, sort of we're in this movement for social and racial justice. We're seeing democratic norms just sort of be eroded across the board. There's been a sweeping deregulation of environmental laws over the last 3 years. And now we have an upcoming election. So there's just a lot going on. So how are you personally sort of reflecting and making sense of all these sort of entangled occurrences?
There's a lot going on. Complexity is really difficult to acknowledge because we're in it. You know, it's not something that we're analyzing in our history books. This is something that we're stuck in the web of, and it's intimidating. And the pandemic has created this opportunity, I think, to see some of that complexity firsthand. All of this is, you know, the way that we're going to deal with the crisis was set up well before the pandemic hit our shores. But it's given opportunity, I think, for the public here to see how we're set up to deal with problems. And I wrote an article for Mountain Journal at the beginning of the pandemic, which we can talk about a bit, but that was my way of saying, you know, these problems have been on our doorstep this whole time, and suddenly we've opened the door and we can see them, but these are problems that aren't just related to human health via the pandemic. These are the same problems that are affecting us in our environmental world and human dignity, and just people being able to live their lives, not just people, wildlife, and all of us realizing some kind of healthy future that I continue to go back to. So yeah, I just want to acknowledge it's tough. I'm probably not going to say anything here in this conversation that hasn't already been said, or that hasn't been said better. But what I can speak to is my own experience, and I'll say just at a personal level, it's been difficult as new parents. It's hard in this life moment when one out of maybe many life moments wants to be surrounded by friends and family, both to celebrate this joyful occasion and to have the communal support of raising a child, and to be without that for the last 6 months now has been difficult. And we lost our childcare. That's been hard for my husband and I to manage with work. There are these practical matters that are affecting each of our lives. Nobody's immune from the effects of this pandemic. And so we each have our own stories. That's my story. My story is also that overall I'm faring really well. And, you know, we've been really fortunate. When I do have time where my baby's napping or my husband's caring for him, I sit at this desk and I take that paintbrush I just showed you and I paint really intricate natural history illustrations for interpretive projects. And then I think about what in the world we're going to do. I've taken this moment of the pandemic to be a really reflective moment, and a moment to ask some big picture questions of myself. What am I to do in this moment of global crisis? What is society to do in this moment? How can we align our values within institutions and policy to move through this in a way where we're preserving the most human and non-human lives? And I mean the pandemic, and I mean, problems beyond the pandemic too. So I'm taking this moment to be really reflective, and I encourage that also in that Mountain Journal article. I think that if this isn't a breaking point for us as a society, I'm not quite sure what we're going to need to get there, but that scares me. And I think a lot of people feel broken right now. So my hope is that as we come out of this, we can do so with laying a groundwork that gets us on a better trend line, because the trend line we're on right now is looking pretty dismal.
What I took away from your article, and something that I think about all the time, is just like sort of thinking about the fact that each individual life is practically being affected by something that is truly like the definition of environmental. It literally started from like a wildlife trafficking market, and now it's being like transmitted through air that we breathe every day. It's like a really thin sort of biofilm moment that we're all realizing. So the question that I think you're asking in that article is like, can this open up a new environmental consciousness around the world? Because we're living through something that's so tied to the environment. So I think you asked that really wonderfully in that article, and I think it's something that we need that might actually have some hope to it as far as like what comes out of this pandemic.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that was my take on it back in April, was hope. And I reread that article last night, and at the beginning I said, we're in the middle of it. Okay, and that was April. And we're in some month in the fall. I'm not quite sure what month we're in, but we're long past that. And I remain hopeful, but pragmatically hopeful. I think you're absolutely right. What I was trying to demonstrate with the pandemic is that we are intricately reliant on the natural world for our own human survival. So to think that we can go about our lives, pursuing wealth and power without concern for the destruction we're causing to the natural world around us is absurd. And maybe it's going to work for this generation, but then what happens to all of these future generations ahead of us? And I think I feel even more connected to those future generations now that I have my own future generation alive on this earth today, in the form of my son. And it's urgent. And so my call for that kind of reflection in that article, I was doing that reflection. I was hoping, there's only limited reach that I would have from an article like that, but my hope is that together we can be reflective in this moment. But as I've seen since that article was published in April, that doesn't seem to be what we're doing right now. I see a handful of individuals and institutions who are, and op-eds will come out, or blog posts that are really encouraging from groups like NRCC and others, that are the same people though who were speaking this message before the pandemic. And in the meantime, the complexity occurring around us in the world and the uncertainty is just accelerating. We have this major polarization in our country and world around values. We don't call them values necessarily, but that's what they come down to. Our leadership is failing us, and I don't want to get into that any more than just to say that. And then we have this complete breakdown in trust of institutions and systems and processes and science. And to think that in this moment where there's something that's actively killing humans, and we can't get together to say, this is important, let's work together to move past this. it's just hard to be hopeful that we might be able to take a different course of action with something like climate change, or with something like biodiversity loss, or the loss of wild places. So I'm going to continue to do my work, and I hope that everybody continues, the good fight. But I also want to be realistic about what we're seeing, evidence that's coming up about what's possible.
Yeah, it's deeply concerning, the sort of trends that we've seen in the 5 months since that article was written, and the actions and sort of trend and policy that we've seen hasn't pushed us in the sort of environmental philosophy, ethics realm that so many like yourself are writing about in this moment. So it's like, we have that ways of thinking available to us, but we're not, as a collective, like turning it into action. So we'll see. We're still very much in the middle of this.
Yeah, we are.
So moving on to the third question, and this kind of gets back to what we've already you touched on a bit, so here at NRCC, as you know well, we've sort of long fostered this sort of interdisciplinary way of thinking about issues in the environment, and really trying to raise and elevate voices that have many and diverse perspectives on that style of work. So I was wondering, like, you've already mentioned a little bit, but maybe a little bit more deeply about how you sort of came to see yourself as an interdisciplinarian, and then as an and more specifically as an artist and as a person with a lot of experience in policy and science. How do you work across those lines? How do you think about yourself when you work across those lines? So
this interdisciplinary and contextual thinking is what I mentioned really was a difficult concept for me to understand and to apply when I first encountered it back in grad school. So I thought it might be helpful in this conversation to just start by laying a bit of a foundation of what the goal is, why we would want to be interdisciplinary and contextual, why that's important to the work that I do, and why that should be important to the work that we do in, within the conservation community. So when I think of working in those ways, I think of being the most effective problem solver that I can be, because that's really what we're doing every day, is we're just solving tons of problems all the time. What are we gonna eat for dinner tonight? How am I gonna get this kid down for a nap? How are we gonna prevent catastrophic biodiversity loss and sea level rise? So we're just constantly solving problems. And the better we are at identifying what the problem is at hand, the more likely we are to actually solve the thing that we're calling a problem. So an example that made this evident for me just the other day was, one of my sisters is a doctor, and I was talking to her on the phone about this spider bite that I had that had caused an allergic reaction that was sending intense pain around one side of my body. And she told me that I actually didn't correctly identify what I was experiencing. This was not a spider bite and an allergic reaction to a spider bite. I had shingles. And so you could imagine how thinking you have a spider bite is a lot different from thinking and knowing you have shingles. And that the prescriptions for those two ways of solving or identifying the problem would look vastly different. I think, and I won't go into that metaphor anymore, but just to say that I think we take for granted that when we talk about environmental problems, we know what the answers are. We talk about environmental problems like they are problems with wildlife, and we have wildlife biologists who work really hard to try to bring to light, data about said wildlife. They create maps. We bring more experts into the room. This is a wildlife problem. This is a spider bite. But if you have shingles, here I am with this metaphor again, but you're trying to solve it with, anti-itch ointment, that you're not going to get very far. And what I see with the environmental movement is we continue to prescribe these superficial superficial approaches to much more complex problems than we're giving credit for. So what I'm hoping is that with interdisciplinary and contextual work, we are correctly identifying problems. And the closer we get at correctly identifying a problem, we're at much better odds to prescribe the right prescription to that problem. And this is all within the context of identifying what our goal is in the first place. Is our goal to live in a society where we are putting above all else, economic gain and making money and giving people power? Or are we valuing as a society living in communities where people are free and living dignified lives, and where we're living in a whole healthy ecosystem? So interdisciplinary and contextual thinking in conservation thinks about all that stuff, and that's why it's complex and hard, and why it was difficult for me to wrap my brain around for a long time, because it just is not the traditional status quo approach to conservation that I liked to think of, and that made it simple and made it kind of something that seemed like I could get at myself. So anyway, that's kind of my why. And then to get at the how of all of that, I work in all these fields, and I think I found that to be an interdisciplinary and contextual worker in the conservation field, it's really difficult to be in a single discipline to do that. It's kind of counter to the term itself. So I do art and I do writing, and I engage in science and research and outreach and policy, because bringing all those things together in an integrated way really is getting us a little bit closer towards this goal. With education, one way to think about bringing forth an interdisciplinary experience for people, this is education outreach, even interpretive communications, is one, just acknowledging that this complexity exists, and working with people to clarify their own goals and to identify common and shared values. So I think art is something that I'm trying to give a platform to within conservation, because I think it has this unique ability to do some of that. But there are a lot of other really successful interdisciplinary conservationists doing work who aren't artists, of course. I read something in Mountain Journal, which is a publication out of Bozeman for folks who don't know, last week, that I thought spoke really well to what it means to be an interdisciplinary outreach educator person working on the front lines. And that is that we need to really think hard about how to present facts. So we have this information, and we can call it facts, and it's the best information we have. But that those facts can be presented in different ways. And if we're not presenting facts within the context and the language of the culture and values surrounding us, then it maybe we hear it, maybe we don't hear it, but it doesn't have the same power or truth to it then. So that's something that I really try to espouse as an educator in this field.
That's essential to know that, like, facts are always nested within a social process. I think that's really important, and great analogy and great metaphor. like if your goal is economic gains, you're going to go with the cheapest ointment to treat that spider bite, knowing that the shingles is like the systemic issue. So like, I think you should write an article and expand on that metaphor. It's really good. Thank you for that. That was really helpful. So for question 4, maybe this one we can like delve into your book, The Artist's Guide to Yellowstone, a little bit deeper. Sort of the question is like, how have you evolved over the years? But you've spoken really eloquently on that so far. So maybe thinking more precisely about the 8 years that your book has been a project, how has the book evolved along that time frame, and then what has changed in your own writing and editing process along those 8 years?
Yeah, the book to me is a really helpful example of my attempt to become more integrated and contextual in my work. So 8 years ago, when I started this project, I was somebody who was pretty geeked out about natural history and saw a linear path between um, natural history education, kind of what we think of as environmental education, and people becoming informed citizens who are going to support conservation. And this book was kind of my attempt to contribute to that cause, was to put some cool natural history idea out there with a bit of a modern spin on it, but I didn't have the context to really understand how this book could contribute within the social context of the world. And thankfully, I, through mentorship from NRCC and others, I was encouraged and challenged to make that a more integrated project as I went along. So originally I had intended to work with 25 artists who were going to be illustrating 25 different species of Greater Yellowstone's wildlife. And I would be doing all the biological illustrations, and then I was planning to do writing for each of those that kind of described in more colorful detail what a grizzly bear is, what a moose is, what a bison is, what a cutthroat trout is. And I had some really great advice from a professor at the School of Forestry to, and maybe this came out of the fact that I'm not an amazing writer, I'm a perfectly adequate writer, but he suggested that instead of me doing all of the essays for the book, that I actually work with in the same format as 25 different artists. I work with 25 different writers to do those written pieces to pair with the artwork, which was an awesome idea, and it presented new challenges, of course, because that's bringing twice as many new people into this community of contributors. It took some of the pressure off me on writing, but it presented new challenges. But really, it was an opportunity to bring 25 more new perspectives and standpoints and voices into this project. So that's just one example of how this project got to be more integrated over time. I think that I just didn't fully understand, like I said, the way that natural history needs more globbed onto it for it to be an effective method for education in the way that's going to create social change. And so I was also able to provide some context to the publication through a preface and a foreword to hopefully bring some of that to light for readers. So I'll admit that this book is not going to change the world. The book is maybe going to change no minds. But what I'm really proud of is the book serving as an example of an unusually integrated interdisciplinary project that's like really tangible and available for wide popular audiences. Because, you and I, Ben, are having this conversation and we have folks listening in, and that's great. And maybe the words that we're using are familiar to everyone on this list. And yet, like, we're talking about a revolution that needs to happen. And for that to occur, we need to be connecting with every person on this planet. And I'm hoping that the book can be something that is a bit of a, like giving over to the community as a whole within the Greater Yellowstone area, outside of just conservation, that it is appealing to people who aren't natural history geeks like me, because it displays artwork, because it has interesting prose and poetry, and can be this example of working together, to integrate, and yeah, just what it means for people to be given a platform for their voice too. So it's been a journey. It's been 8 years of ups and downs. I'm really glad we're close to the book coming out, and I hope we have opportunities to do events on the backside of that. But I'd be curious to see how the book would change if I were to have started it, you know, if I were kicking it off today, because it might look a little bit different, but I'm still proud of the work that's been done on it.
Maybe we can get a round 2 and hold
Let's do it.
I think you're hitting on, like, the work that you do is much more foundational and sort of cultural and expressive, and that's like inherently means you're going to work on a time frame that's much longer than how we usually think about movements and social change. So you know, it might be something that is someone reads in 30 years and like it speaks to them. So it feels like a long lasting project, and that feels important to sort of reframe our timing of how we think about environmental stuff. So that was really interesting, and maybe we can have some time at the end to talk even a little bit more. But so question 5, the last question, very put simply, what are the 3 pieces of advice that you'd like to share with the audience and the sort of greater world? And you can take that however you'd like.
Yeah, it's a question, as my robot vacuum is yelling at me right now. Sorry about those beeps. That I don't feel totally deserving of being given a platform to address that. So I'll say if anything resonated with folks who were listening, then maybe these are some things to think about. My first piece of advice that I'd like to give is to get to know other people. And specifically, I mean people outside of your current social circle. I mean, talk to store clerks, talk to your neighbors, strike up a conversation with somebody at a trailhead, and understand genuinely, be genuine and kind here, but really try to get to know new perspectives and ways of worldviews, ways of being, and build this community around that. And I think it's a great way to build empathy and perspective and an awareness of your own social environment that often we take for granted. My second piece of advice would be to get to know yourself. So get to know others, get to know yourself. I think rigorous self-reflection goes a long way. And one of the ways that I like to think about undertaking this kind of self-examination is to think about what assumptions I'm making that are affecting the way that I go about my life and worldview, and how this worldview is contributing to a future that I want to realize for all of us. To highlight what I mean by those first 2, get to know other people, get to know yourself. There's this comic that I really like that is of 2 fish in a fish tank. One of the fish asks the other fish, "How's the water?" And the second fish says, "What is water?" So water, we're all swimming in water. Water is culture. Water is society. And I would say we're better off acknowledging the water and knowing how to swim through it. So that's where those 2 pieces of advice come from. And then the last piece of advice is that I would just like to advocate for self-authorization, which is to say, don't wait for somebody in authority to give you permission to do good work. And my book has been an example for me of why it's worth it to just go and start that thing that's on your mind. And I encourage people to do that today. So I'll leave you all with that.
That was wonderful. And yeah, just helpful for me to hear, and helpful for all of us to hear. And I think that's the last 3rd piece of advice is really important, in that we often just wait for ourselves to go to school or to get a job or to someone else to tell us to do something, when in reality we can just do it. Like, we don't have to have credentials, we can just do things. So that's really helpful. So thank you, Katie, for all of that. That was really wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing so much about yourself and your work. I took a lot away from it, and I'm hoping the audience did too. So I think we'll open it up to Q&A here. So if you have a question, feel free to put it into the chat box. Right now, I don't really see any, but if you have one, feel free to put it in there. I'll give you like 10 seconds to type it in there.
And there are a couple of questions in the Q&A.
Okay. Let's look there. Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. First question. This is from Matt Barnes, who's also a research associate. I think this is a really topical question to the moment, and especially the fact that you're living in Colorado. So his question is, would you share your perspective on wolf restoration in Western Colorado?
Man, I would love to like beam Matt into this for him to tell us what he thinks about it. Because for folks who don't know, Matt is awesome, and I would love to know his perspective on this topic. I had the opportunity to work with Karen Bardeman, who for a while was leading the wolf restoration efforts for Defenders of Wildlife, but now has broken off and is part of a working circle group working with ranchers who are in that area who are going to be likely faced with reintroducing wolves. People who don't know, it's on the ballot in November, so we can vote on that. I'm of mixed minds. I want us to have wild landscapes, and I think that intact ecosystems are better than degraded ecosystems. So I want wolves on the landscape. The best way to do that, of course, is up for debate. And one of the challenges with the current plan of kind of forced reintroduction through a ballot measure would be that people who might be in a position where they're going to feel the burden of wolves on their back doorstep more than somebody who's living in the Front Range, feel like this decision is being made for them by metropolitan Denver. And instead of the possibility of coexistence happening by migration, wolves from the greater Yellowstone ecosystem have made their way down into Colorado. And those wolves are protected, but those are two different scenarios for what coexistence could look like. Wolves being reintroduced to a landscape in the way that they were in Yellowstone National Park, as opposed to wolves crossing boundaries on their own because they're geopolitical boundaries that wolves don't see, and making a go of it in a new landscape. So Matt, I think, like I said, I'd love to follow up with you to hear what you think is the best method. I would love to see wolves back on the landscape in Western Colorado. I'm going to vote for that we get them back on the landscape, but I am curious if that is really the best method when we know that migration is possible too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's like Colorado as a state is such a politically interesting state, in that people on the Front Range have very different political perspectives than folks in more rural areas. And those are the places where wolves will be. So I think that's an important point you're making. The next question is from Amy Lewis, and she asks, I think sort of speaking to like the sort of pandemic moment that we're in, she writes, we're on the cusp of the ordinary and the cusp of business as usual as well. What would transformative action look like? And that could be I'm not sure what scale, but any way you want to take that.
Yeah, man, Amy, that's the question of the hour. That's kind of what we're all going for here, I think. I think transformative action looks a bit like not acknowledging the current rules of society and not acknowledging the current social norms, and doing work that transcends that. And as an individual, that's me getting up in the morning and doing work that isn't groundbreaking, but I think is a little bit rule breaking. I found with my book that I could see the spaces in our social network where there is space for and room for an acceptance of new ideas and methods. And I saw the places in our society where they're just so much more closed down around the conventional. So it's kind of, as at an individual level, I think that transformative action is just kind of to the self-authorization thing, giving something a go and finding the spaces for give and pull and take in society, and where you can kind of throw your elbows out and make some space for yourself. At a community level, I think that's identifying some shared values and common interests, and working within decision-making processes to, and hopefully those processes are democratic, but working within decision-making to insist that common interest is in our interest, and kind of fighting against these special interests that we often are convinced of our common interest. Is it in the common interest for a handful of businesses to continue to amass enormous amounts of wealth? They'd like to think it is. They'd like us to think that it is. I don't think that it is. I think it's in the common interest that we live in a healthy ecosystem where all life can thrive. So yeah, Amy, to your question, I think the transformative action is an experiment, and it can happen at individual and multiple levels, and we desperately need that. We need that revolution. So let's talk more.
Great answer. I think that speaks to, like, first step is like understanding what is the sort of conventional norms that we're operating within, sort of the fundamental stories. So yeah, great answer. I think last question to sort of summarize some of the last ones is maybe what are some of the ways that you're finding consolation or allowing yourself to feel optimistic about the future? Maybe what are some strategies that you're employing to feel optimistic about the future?
You know, I like to know that the sun is going to rise in the morning and set at night. There are these systems that are so much greater than our social system that we've been talking about for the last hour, that are continuing to occur and function despite this mess that we're making for ourselves. So some of that I find to be really grounding, and I find that by spending time in nature. So that's a high personal value for me and helps me return to optimism. I think also, if this is a question from the Mike Johnson, who is my buddy, then Mike, it's people like you, it's people like Ben, it's this community that I surround myself with, who I think are doing really important work, better work than I'm doing, and who aren't giving up and who themselves are optimistic. There's this like shared kind of collective, let's keep our chins up, guys, because we don't get to take a day off. And that keeps me going. And so I'm grateful for the people that I see who are young and old all over the world, getting up in the morning and who are continuing to give this a go. And I think that I just really think that there's hope in the common interest. I think that I'm just really hopeful that people will see that healthy ecosystems and healthy human communities are good for us all. And so we're getting there, and something like the pandemic might be a little bit of a silver lining to bring that to the light for a larger group of people. Thanks for the question.
Great question. Great answer. That, I think, surrounding ourselves with people that are also inspired to work hard and attend to these issues, I think, is a great strategy. So thank you so much, Katie. That was amazing and really helpful and insightful. So thank you for taking the time today. That was great. So thank you so much, Katie.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks to everyone for joining. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. And thank you to everyone who attended. I'll just put out a quick announcement that we have one more of these sessions in 2 weeks on Thursday, September 24th. And we'll be talking to Rebecca Waters, who is a research associate who's also sort of based in Bozeman. And Rebecca is a wildlife biologist and social scientist who works at the intersection of culture, human rights, and conservation. And she's worked all over the world, but most recently in Mongolia, where she studies wolverines and other climate-sensitive wildlife in collaboration with local communities. So she has really interesting stories to tell, and really sort of building on so much of what Katie and other speakers have talked about. So I think it'll be a great sort of final conversation. So once again, thank you to Katie, and I hope everyone has a safe and healthy 2 weeks, and we'll see you all on September 24th. So I'll sign off here. So thanks everyone for joining today.
Thanks, Ben. Talk to you soon.
All right, bye.